the ninth week. We're going to tackle Chapter 9, Cognition and Perception. One of the things that we need to remember about looking at the way other people see things is that their vision isn't the same as ours. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today is different ways of thinking about things. There we go. Okay. When stimuli are grouped according to the perceived similarity of their attributes, it is called a taxonomic categorization strategy. Taxonomic categorization answers are especially common among Westerners. So if we were putting these, if we were looking at this picture and how would we categorize it? How would we organize the structure of this picture? One way we could do it, we could put the rabbit and the puppy together because they're both mammals, or we could put the carrot and the rabbit together because the rabbit eats carrots. It really all depends on how you see things. Thematic categorization strategy is where stimuli are grouped together on the basis of causal, temporal, or spatial relationships. Thematic categorization is especially common in East Asia. This difference in categorization strategies reflects an underlying difference in the ways that people attend to their worlds. Analytic thinking is characterized by a focus on objects and their attributes. Objects are perceived as existing independently from their context. They are understood in terms of their component parts. Context is very important. The attributes that make up objects are used as a basis for categorizing them, and a set of fixed abstract rules is used to predict and explain the behavior of these objects. Analytic thinking is more common in Western countries than in China, Japan, and Korea. Holistic thinking is characterized by an orientation to the context as a whole. It represents an associative way of thinking, which gives attention to the relations among objects and the surrounding context. So this would be the holistic way of thinking. This would be the analytical way of thinking. In holistic thinking, objects are understood in terms of how they relate to the rest of the context, and their behavior is predicted and explained on the basis of these relationships. Holistic thinking also emphasizes knowledge gained through experience rather than the application of fixed abstract rules. Holistic thinking is more common, of course, in East Asia than in the Western world. Analytic thinkers tend to show field independence. They can separate objects from their background fields. Holistic thinkers tend to show field dependence. They tend to view objects as bound to their backgrounds. And of course, if we look at this, and if we look at this long enough, what we see is a picture of Michael Jackson. And of course, if we look at this, we may think that we are looking at a headless, at a torso-less individual, but what we're actually seeing is a lady holding a mirror, and her torso is behind the mirror. East Asians have been socialized from such a young age to attend to relationships that they do so unconsciously scanning scenes. Westerners have been socialized to attend to focal objects, and they thus habitually tend to direct their attention at such objects. Looking at the art of East Asia, we can see that the art is very different from Western art. East Asian art is painted with a higher horizon, creating more context in the picture. In their portraits, the background is much more complex, and the figures in the paintings are smaller than in Western art. And these are pictures from China. This is a photograph from China, and as you can see, it has the context is very important, and this, of course, has a higher horizon. Therefore, we have far more context. And the same way with these two pictures. This is a Korean picture, and this is a Chinese picture. As we can see, we're dealing with a great deal of context. These are from Japan. As you can see, we have lots Lots of interesting things going on in the picture, lots of context. This is from the Louvre. As you can see, the background is not all that important. This background is not all that important. It is the figures that are more important. And the figures are much larger than they are in the Eastern pictures. Masuda and Gonzalez and colleagues in 2008 had American and East Asian students draw landscapes with a person, river, tree, house, and a horizon. They were seeking to see the difference between the two groups. East Asians drew a horizon that was significantly higher in the picture than it was for Americans. East Asians tended to provide a more complex background in their drawings. East Asians included 75% more contextual objects than did the Americans. East Asians were more likely than Americans to situate their objects in the context. When East Asians take photographs of others, they tend to include more background. They also tend to have smaller figures in their portraits compared to Americans. And these are East Asian pictures. That's an East Asian picture. There's an American picture. There's your two more American pictures and two more Western pictures or American pictures. When Masada and Gonzalez and colleagues in 2008 looked at American and East Asian Facebook pages, they found that East Asian photos had smaller figures and larger backgrounds compared to American photos. And this is an East Asian photo. These are East Asian photos. As you can see, it has a very complex background. These are East Asian photos, the same thing. Very complex background. Looking at Japanese photographs of buildings, researchers discovered that these photographs had more boundary structures than American photographs. This is an East Asian photograph, East Asian photographs. Physical landscapes from Japan are literally busier than landscapes in the United States. And of course, this is extremely busy. This is a picture of a derelict building. Two more pictures from Asia. Those are both in Japan. Here we have in the United States. This is the U.S. Capitol. This is a church somewhere. Not nearly as complex. And two more pictures from the United States. And that's the Chrysler Building in New York City. Since cities in East Asia tend to be more crowded than Western cities, living in the busier physical environment fosters the ability to attend to a lot more information at once. When they looked at how scientists from East Asia present their findings on posters, they had busier posters with more words than North American participants. And this is a North American poster, and this is an East Asian poster from China. And as you can see, it's very, very busy. Researchers looked at government and university websites in East Asia and North America. The Asian websites were much longer than the North American websites and had significantly more links and words. The East Asian websites were busier with more information for people to navigate. And this is a government website from China. Researchers discovered that Westerners were more likely to explain people's behaviors in terms of their underlying dispositions, while East Asians and possibly people from other cultures were more likely to explain people's behaviors in terms of contextual variables. So late, you lazy bum, my assignment. So late may be a family issue. Context. When people from India and the United States were asked to describe a person, the Americans were more likely to describe people in abstract personality traits, and Indians described people in concrete behaviors they observed. She is friendly. She brings cake to my family on festival days. Researchers analyzing news stories of murders in the United States, China, and Japan discovered that the East Asian papers described the murders in situational terms. The murderer had a rivalry with another student. They had been recently fired. The American reports tried to interpret the situation from a dispositional point of view. The murderer had a very bad temper. The shooter was described as mentally unstable. Personality information is not seen as equally important for explaining the behavior of others in all cultural contexts. Westerners tend to use personality information more for understanding others and themselves than East Asians do. People from many other non-Western cultures show a pattern of focusing on situation rather than disposition, similar to East Asians. Religious groups differ in their attributions as well. American Protestants are more likely than American Catholics to make dispositional attributions. This difference between sects appears to be a function of Protestants having a greater commitment to the idea that people have individual souls rather than group souls. If people believe that people are judging them on the basis of what their soul has done, it follows that they are more likely to view the soul as being the cause of the individual's behavior. People's socioeconomic status predicts the kinds of attributions that people make. Working class Americans make more situational attributions and fewer dispositional attributions than middle class Americans. The same kinds of class differences in explaining other people's behaviors have also been found in France. It's also been found in Russia. It's also been found in India. If analytic thinkers tend to view the world as operating to a set of universal abstract rules and laws, they will apply these rules and laws when trying to make sense of a situation. This is termed rule-based reasoning. Holistic thinkers should be more likely to make sense of a situation by considering the relationships among objects and events. They should look for evidence of events clustering together, such as similarity among events or of temporal contiguity of events. This is termed associative reasoning. Westerners appear to view change as occurring in linear ways. Change appears in static and predictable ways. Stock rises after an election. Stocks will rise in 2020. East Asians believe that change happens in fluid and unpredictable ways. One day, an old farmer's horse ran away from him. His neighbors came by to comfort him, but he said, "How can you know it isn't a good thing?" A few days later, his horse came back, bringing a wild horse with him. His neighbors came to congratulate the old man, who said, "How can you know it isn't a bad thing?" A few weeks later, the old farmer's son was trying to ride the wild horse and fell off, breaking his leg. When the neighbors came over to express condolences, the old man said, "How can you know it isn't a good thing?" The next month, a war broke out, and all the able-bodied young men were recruited to fight it. The old farmer's son did not have to go because of his broken leg and survived with his father. East Asians have been shown to place more value on things that have happened in the past compared with the future. The opposite is found with North Americans. Attitudes toward future vary across cultures, and East Asians have quite different expectations and predictions about the future compared with Westerners. Creativity is a generation of ideas that are novel, useful, and appropriate. Westerners prefer novel objects more than East Asians. They generate a larger number of ideas when they are primed with individualistic thoughts than collectivistic ones. And Asian Americans show more divergent thinking when primed with American culture compared with Asian culture. The novelty part of the equation appears to be facilitated by individualism and Western cultural experiences. Good creative ideas involve novel solutions that are appropriate for the problem at hand. Collectivism appears to be associated with the generation of useful rather than novel ideas. In collective contexts, people are socialized to be concerned about the opinions of others and to find solutions that will fit with the goals of the members of the group. When Singaporeans were assigned to work together, researchers discovered that they were more likely to comment on appropriateness of their ideas than when they worked by themselves. Their ideas became less original in groups because Singapore is part of East Asia. When the same research was done in Israel, they found that the Israelis were not affected by the presence of others in the same way. When the same research was done in the Netherlands, they found that the Dutch were not affected by the presence of others in the same way. When the same research was done in Korea, they found that the Koreans reacted more similarly to the Singaporeans than the Israelis and the Dutch. More collectivistic East Asian cultures, with their emphasis on useful ideas, are more likely to foster incremental innovations, whereas more individualistic Western cultures, with their emphasis on novel ideas, encourage more breakthrough ideas. Japan is the world leader in terms of number of patents it receives each year. Most of their patents represent incremental improvements, particularly in telecommunications, information technology, and electronics. Talking and language have held a privileged position in much of Western intellectual history. Among the ancient Greeks, Homer concluded that there was no greater skill than to be a good debater. And Socrates thought that knowledge existed within people and could be revealed only through verbal reasoning. In Judeo-Christian belief, the word was viewed as sacred because of the divine power to create. In the United States, the freedom to speak one's mind is a birthright, protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. Speaking is valued in the West because it is viewed as an act of self-expression and as inextricably bound to thought. In East Asian cultural traditions, there has been less emphasis on talking, if not outright suspicion, of the spoken word. And this is a Laotian proverb, listen with one ear, be suspicious with the other. That's from Laos, which of course is right beside Vietnam. It is a Southeast Asian country. Lao Tzu wrote, "He who knows does not speak, he who speaks does not know." And of course, Lao Tzu was a Chinese philosopher. Practitioners of many Eastern religions pursue truth through silent meditation rather than through spoken prayer. A Korean proverb states, "An empty cart makes more noise." Eastern cultural traditions have not cultivated a belief that thought and speech are closely related. Japanese mothers have been shown to speak less to their children than American mothers. Chinese infants as young as 7 months have been shown to vocalize less in response to laboratory events than European American infants. Much of what is communicated in the course of a conversation goes beyond the actual words that are used and is expressed in nonverbal gestures, facial expressions, and voice tone. People seem to be easier to upset in an email than when you are face to face with them. They can't see your smile or your wink. People often resort to adding emoticons or abbreviations to their email or text messages to add their nonverbal contextual cues that are lacking in emails or text messages. Nonverbal communication is important in all cultures, but there are some rather pronounced cultural differences in the degree to which communication relies on explicit verbal information versus more implicit nonverbal cues. In high-context cultures, people are deeply involved with each other, and this involvement leads them to have much shared information that guides their behavior. Much of what is to be communicated can be inferred because people have a great deal of information in common that they can rely on, and thus they can be less explicit in what they say. East Asians are good examples of high context cultures. Western and English-speaking countries are generally good examples of low context cultures. What is conveyed in verbal communication in East Asian languages is less explicit than what is communicated in English. And this is one of the reasons why the Americans get in trouble in Japan, for example. One of the reasons that they moved the Marine bases off of out of Japan is because the Marines kept getting into trouble, and one of the reasons they got into trouble is because they were trying to pick up young ladies. The young ladies were not really listening to what they were saying. The context wasn't nearly as important as the implied context. And for that reason, they were trying to say no, and the GIs weren't picking it up. I guess the Marines, they weren't GIs, they were Army, they were Marines. So they had to move all the Marine bases off of Japan and its islands. The words that are said in Japan are often less important than the way that they are said. And of course, this wasn't acknowledged by the Marines. A pause and a strained look on the face of a Japanese speaker communicates that the information they have is dissatisfying no matter what words they use. The key information is conveyed non-verbally, with the content of the words sometimes being rather empty. And of course, we had this problem during World War II. The Japanese were trying to tell us that they didn't like what we were doing. We had stopped selling them scrap metal, and we had stopped selling them fuel, and they were trying to tell us that they didn't like what we were doing. We thought that the Japanese, we took them at their word, and unfortunately, of course, they were trying to indicate that they were very displeased. This kind of thing happens today in Japan, and this is one of the reasons that American Marines tend to get in trouble in Japan, because Japanese don't like to say no, so they say yes to everything, and then it has to do with their facial expressions as to whether they actually mean yes or no. And of course, the Marines it's a low context culture. The U.S. culture is a low context culture, and therefore they don't take the message. They don't get the message. Neither did the United States just before World War II. Since so much is conveyed through nonverbal communication by the Japanese, they tend to have far more trouble leaving messages on answering machines. They're more selective of their wording because they are visualizing how the person on the other end is receiving their message. And that is the end of the chapter. So I'll talk to you next week. Next week we will tackle chapter 10. Next week will be the 10th week. So I hope you had a good break, spring break, and I will see you next week.